I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. My name is Robert Pellicciari. I'm the manager of inclusive assessment here at the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. And if you signed on for today's presentation, it means you signed on to learn more about the MCAS grade level and competency portfolio assessments. These are not MCAS-Alts. Again, just repeat, these are not MCAS-Alts based on alternative achievement standards for students with significant intellectual impairments. These are portfolio options, an alternative option for students who are achieving at or near grade level. So I just want to make sure we're all in the same spot. I'm joined by a couple people today. I'm going to be joined by our Cognia program manager, who we work with to help present the slides and information and run the scoring, Kevin Froten. And I'm also going to be joined by a couple American Sign Language interpreters to assist everyone access this presentation. So you should be able to see them in the right-hand side of the screen. And again, my name is Robert Pellicciari. I'm the manager of inclusive assessment here at the department. And what does that mean? It means I provide information on the grade level competency portfolio. I also help and assist our other colleagues with the access testing for English learners, as well as the standard MCAS-Alt, as well as providing guidance on MCAS accommodation policies. Today, we're going to hear about a few things. We're going to hear a lot about the MCAS grade level competency portfolio. We're going to hear what are they, who are they for, how to compile them. But first, let's talk a little bit about some logistics. We have a Q&A feature to ask questions. So there's a Q&A button that you can ask questions. And after the session, I will stop and I will answer the questions. I will answer a lot of them live, but I will go through all the questions and type responses and send them to the attendees after. But I'm not going to write the responses during the presentation. So if you write a question, please be patient. I'll probably answer that verbally, but I am going to write a written response and you'll receive that after the presentation. About a week or so after this presentation, a recording as well as the slides will be posted on the MCAS Resource Center website. If you can see this link on your screen, MCAS Resource Center is bolded. If you select that link, that would take you to the MCAS Resource Center website, where this and other trainings, recordings of trainings and the slides are posted. If you have questions about a specific student relatively to MCAS grade level or competency portfolios or others, it would be a good idea to email mcas@doe.mess.edu. We've allotted about 45 minutes for today's presentation, or an hour, I should say. But I don't suspect we'll get through this. We'll need the whole hour. We'll probably take about half an hour for the presentation. And I really want to leave a lot of time at the end for questions. So I plan to stay with everyone as long as need be to make sure all their questions are answered. We're going to talk about a few things today. As I mentioned earlier in the agenda, we're going to talk a little bit about what is a grade level portfolio. We're going to talk about who should be considered for a grade level or competency portfolio. What's the difference between a grade level and competency portfolio? Some of the basic requirements to complete those. I'm going to show you some resources and the general process to compile a grade level or competency portfolio. There's a chat icon at the bottom of your screen. In the chat icon, if you open it up, you'll see that there's a Kevin Froten posted information here about slides and trainings. If you click on that link, you can access all of that material. So let's talk a little bit about what type of student who could be considered for a grade level or competency portfolio. Now, much has changed in previous years if you attended these trainings. In some, we're talking about a student who has some significant challenges, that's complex, and they can't demonstrate their true knowledge and skills on the standard MCAS test, even with accommodations. What's different about this, as opposed to the MCAS-Alt, is these students are working at or near grade level. They're not several grade levels below. They're not performing at basic levels of learning elements of the standards. We're talking about a student that is in 7th or 8th grade. And for the most part, the student is included as much as possible with the general classroom work. They're doing work similar in complexity to their peers, but you know the nature of standardized assessments, you know the nature of their disability, really prevents them from accessing the test, even with accommodations, and they can't really demonstrate their true knowledge and skills. What's interesting about this option is if you complete this option and the student meets all the requirements, they can earn an achievement score similar to a student taking the standard MCAS test. Students who take the MCAS-Alt, because they are achieving significantly below grade level and working at alternate, significantly adjusted achievement levels and curriculum levels, they cannot earn a passing score on the MCAS test. The most they could ever earn is a score of progressing, which is not in the partially meeting expectations range. I want to reiterate that point. So what are some examples of students that could be appropriate for a grade level or competency portfolio? What type of students we're talking about? Well, we're talking about students with perhaps they have a significant emotional or behavior disability. Perhaps they have a significant health-related challenge or a significant motor disability. Let's say, for example, you work with a student and you know the student sometimes will use the term have some significant challenges with emotional regulation. They become dysregulated a lot of times. This could be for a variety of reasons. And you know what a standard test, if you were give it to them, the complexity of it, their frustration tolerance is such that they're not going to be able to complete it. They're going to leave the room, the testing environment. They may rip up the test. They may just go through it quickly, and you're not going to be able to get an assessment on it, but you really want the student to do their best and demonstrate their skills. This might be an opportunity for them. Some students really have a trouble shifting gears. Perhaps their work, they can understand an isolated task with information that are presented to them, how to respond and answer questions related to, say, let's say slope. They work with an educator, math teacher, special educator. They can understand how to solve those problems. But if they're presented in a way on the MCAS test where they have to switch gears from doing exponents to slope, and they have to read the question, that complexity of switching gears, the nature of the testing, they're not going to be able to demonstrate their knowledge and skills. They just have a particular challenge with that. You know, there are some students who also have significant just a lack of ability to pay attention for a prolonged period of time for a standardized assessment. If you give them something like the MCAS, where they have, we'll say 40 questions over 2 sessions, they're not going to be able to do it within that particular day. They're going to be like, it's going to take too long. They're going to become tired. They're going to disengage. And through the nature of it, testing will take too long and they won't be able to complete it. That might be a student that might be well suited. Other students with significant motor disabilities, communication challenges, students who perhaps, for lack of a better word, are on the autistic spectrum, you know, for English language arts and for math, they have some skills, just they really can't engage in something that's not familiar with them in the education and the environment. Those are kind of some students that could be considered appropriate. Again, they're achieving near grade level, at or near grade level, but you know you can't get an accurate assessment to the standard MCAS test. Talk a little bit about what is a grade level portfolio. Well, grade level portfolios, if you think of the name portfolio, that's what it is. It is a portfolio of the student's work. What is important is that this portfolio has specific standards that the student must demonstrate they understand. There is not a data charts where they're showing progress. These are just work samples, which are called quizzes, mini assessments. Again, quizzes and assessments, not a worksheet, where the student demonstrates their understanding of that particular standard. Let's say, for example, for numerical number sense and operations, students have to understand fractions. You give a student a quiz on fractions. They answer those questions. You score it like you would a regular quiz. You put that in the binder as a portfolio. You put a cover sheet on it. You collect those evidence for specific required curriculum frameworks. That's going to be the basis of the student's portfolio that you would submit. On the bottom side of this particular screen, you'll see a rough sketch of the standards. Keep in mind that I have all of the requirements. I'll show you later where to find them. But for the purpose of this presentation, I'm just going to give you a rough sketch overview of treetops. For grade level, for grades 3 through 8 for mathematics, you would need to complete at least a total of 10 standards, or the student would, in order to get a score partially meeting expectations or above. For English language arts, a total of 9 standards, or I should say a total of 3 standards for reading literature, 3 standards for reading informational text, and 4 writing examples, one in each text type. So 1 argument claim, 1 narrative, one opinion piece. So that's what they would do, or personal a piece where they would kind of go through that aspect of their standards for reading for literature, informational text. For science, technology, engineering, they would have a total of 9 standards they have to complete, 3 in each of the 3 selected disciplines that were selected by the educator working with the student. Again, treetop's view of the requirements. Important to know that work samples need to address all aspects of the standard. And for each standard, you're going to have more than 1 work sample, more than 1 quiz. High school competency portfolios are very, very similar. The only difference is that high school competency portfolios, students can potentially earn their competency determination, meaning if they submit that they meet all the requirements, they can get their high school diploma through that. So it's an alternate way to achieve what the state calls their competency determination, graduation requirement. It's really also important to know that competency portfolios at the high school level, are cumulative. They can be resubmitted each year with additional material. If you submit a competency portfolio for student in grade 10 in mathematics, student needs 15 standards they need to demonstrate. Student only demonstrated 7. That would be fine. They would get that feedback. They would still not pass a test. It would be still not meeting expectations, but they could start from that point and add more material and potentially receive credit as they progress through their year, progress through their learning with their educator, demonstrate their knowledge through quizzes. Important to know 2 things that I mentioned earlier. One is that the requirements in general are described here on the slides, but the specific requirements are obtainable here by using the links. So if you download the MCAS grade level and competency portfolio manual, you will have access to all the specific requirements. I really suggest you review those if you're considering one of these type of portfolios for a student who you think this would be appropriate assessment for. Important to know, feedback forms are provided for competency portfolios. A feedback form is a specific form in addition to the parent report, and that feedback form tells you how the student did on addressing each standard, whether they met the grade level complexity, grade 10 complexity, whether they met all aspects of the standards, whether the work was independent, is there any missing work that needs to be submitted. For mathematics and English language arts, Treetop's view of the requirements, just so you know, these are all based on the 2017 curriculum frameworks. For English language arts, they have to do 4 large essays. When I say long, long essays, essays of more than a page. A typical 5-paragraph essay, that would be at least 4 of those based on grade level text, the different text, plus 2 short responses based on different grade level text. So if they're meeting a passing portfolio and there's 4 essays and 2 short responses, those are a response to at least 6 different texts. Now, they don't have to read the same book. Let's say, for example, let's say you have a text of Grapes of Wrath. They don't have to read the whole book. They could just read a chapter, or perhaps a few pages where they read the material and you give them a question, a prompt based on what they read, and they have to explain in writing their understanding of the material and their understanding of how to present their argument, their information, how to present their, perhaps, for example, a narrative piece regarding that writing. For mathematics, students have to document they have understanding of at least 15 standards or clustered of standards from the 5 conceptual categories. For science portfolios at the high school level, in general, they're very similar between biology and physics. We only have biology and physics, but there are a couple distinctions. One is that biology, there's a total of 8 standards. 5 are required, 3 are discretionary. Physics, 7 standards, 5 are required, 2 are discretionary. Why? Because not all standards are created equally. Some standards have much more packed in them, much more aspects and knowledge they have to do to demonstrate their understanding of that particular standard. Now, a standard is not all standards are created equally, like I said, but also it's really important to pay attention to the verbs and actions words. For example, if it says identify cellular respiration steps as opposed to identify and describe, those are two different distinctions. One is just you having a quiz with identifying steps in cellular respiration. Other is where the student is describing the essential elements of life and how they work together. Describing a food web as opposed to identifying a producer in a food web. So it's really important to pay attention to the verbs in those particular requirements. Again, they're all spelled out in this MCAS grade level competency portfolio manual. If you want to look for the curriculum frameworks, you could use the blue link on the slide to take you to the curriculum frameworks. Please note, just some reminders, work samples must demonstrate all aspects of the standards. They shouldn't be corrected by the teacher and submitted as the student's own work. They should really be not just multiple choice. They should be really demonstrate the student's thinking, problem solving. These grade level and competency portfolios are going to be submitted on paper. They're going to be submitted in cognitive paper due around the end of March. And if you submit one of these, they really need a cover sheet. Here's an example of a cover sheet for grade level portfolio on the left-hand side and a competency portfolio on the right-hand side. Here is an example, if you look at this particular slide, of what a grade level work description and work sample would look like. So for each work sample, you're going to have two things. You're going to have the student's work, and you're going to have the cover sheet. The cover sheet describes what the student was requested to do, when the student did it, any accommodations, the score the student got, any independence. So if I look here closely at this particular slide, I'll see that we have the student. The student did work on mathematics. This student was in grade 4. The standard was number and base 10 operations. And the standard was to read and write multi-digit whole numbers using base 10 numerals, names, in expanded form. So I look at this particular one and I look at the student's work and it looks like the student got 100%. There was no prompting. So the student did receive some accommodations, work read aloud. If the work is read aloud to the student, that is not a prompt. That's just an accommodation. It does not affect level of independence. If you prompt the student, an acceptable prompt would be, go back, check your work. Each time you prompt a student, the independence is based on the number of problems they have, like before. 10 problems, 1 prompt, 10% independence, off of 100%. So it'd be 90% independence. I hope that makes sense. Here's an example of a competency work description and work sample. You can see here, much like the other one, there's a spot for the name, the date, the standard, number, quantity, accuracy, student use a calculator, what was the student asked to do, solve the problem using order of operations. And the right-hand side of your screen, you see the student work. I mentioned there is a feedback form for competency portfolios. This would be an example of a feedback form that you would receive, the school would receive, and you would share with the student on how well the student demonstrated their understanding of the requirements. There are several columns on this form in areas. Now, it could be a little, I don't think it's necessarily complex to read, but I just want to show you some important information. This happens to be for mathematics, as we can tell, and the student did not meet expectations. So it wouldn't be failing, but not meeting expectations. The student submitted work in number and quantity. Grade level complexity was no. Accurate, complete, no. Independence was 75%. Yes, or higher. Yeah. So what the student did, they didn't receive credit for, not because it wasn't independent, but because the work didn't demonstrate all aspects of the standard, and it wasn't at the grade level complexity. The reviewer gave some specific comments to the educator to develop some work to go back. They said that they need some more examples of order of operations that were at grade level, because order of operations examples were below grade level. No example of exponents. So those are some things that when the educator resubmits this for the student, working with the student, the educator needs to design some problems involving exponents that perhaps have some greater complexity. There's a key here on this bottom right-hand side that tells you whether there was anything sufficient, insufficient, unmatched, or not submitted. As you could see, this particular portfolio, there wasn't anything that was sufficient. There was insufficient, and there was not submitted and unmatched to the standard. If I look here at geometry, it looks like they submitted work in geometry for GCOC, and it looks like they did the work at the grade 10 complexity level, but it wasn't accurate and complete because the student needed to submit a work on isosceles triangles and problems involving ratios and angles. So all you have to do is resubmit problems addressing isosceles triangles and problems involving ratios and angles. The student could potentially receive credit for that. Standard. How are these portfolios scored? As I mentioned earlier, that it's really important that the student addresses all aspects of the required strands and standards. They have to demonstrate all aspects. So if your content experts that score these portfolios, they're looking if the student, quote unquote, or if the educator, quote unquote, dotted the I's and crossed the T's. All aspects of the standards met. Are they required? They demonstrate the understanding of isosceles triangles and ratios. Do they work with the verbs? If it says identify and describe, are they truly describing and identifying? Does the work is the work at the grade level complexity? If they're in high school and they're writing a response to a book they read, the book they read should be on a grade level text. It shouldn't be based on Charlotte's Web if they're in high school. Are the student responses accurate? Is the student work independently produced? We talked about acceptable and unacceptable promptings. Acceptable promptings, for example, you remind the student to show their work. You redirect the student to the test. You tell the student to include correct units. You tell the student to round down. So, for example, you say you work with the student, say Javier. You work with Javier completes the quiz. You notice that Javier went through it too quickly, probably made some mistakes. Say, Javier, go back, take a look at this. I want you to review this before we score it because I noticed you went through it quickly, and I could tell there's a couple problems that you really didn't spend your time on. That would be a prompt. That would be acceptable. It'd be unacceptable to basically give the student the answer in a worksheet, like where you give the student a sample problem on the board, where you provide step-by-step instructions to solve the problem. Those are unacceptable prompts. Same thing for English language arts, for writing. Unacceptable prompt would be having a sentence starter like a Mad Lib, and the student would just fill in the words. That's not really writing. It's not really using language to develop your skills for written language. What are some processes and resources to complete a portfolio? How would you go about it if you identified a student that would need one of these portfolios? What would you do? Well, first, we talked about students who may be appropriate. Obviously, this is not going to be relevant for you unless you have a student that meets this complex challenges, students who really need this different pathway to demonstrate their knowledge for MCAS assessment, MCAS testing. Again, all students are required to participate in MCAS testing. It's not a question of whether or not they participate, it's a question of how. And this would be an option currently. So you determine if a student is appropriate for it, and if the team thinks they're appropriate, we'll start making steps to understand the process. Let's talk with the principal at the school or adults at the school to decide, hey, can we work with the student? Is the student ready to avail themselves of the instruction? How are we going to collect this data? What are the specific portfolio submission requirements? Are there deadlines? If I'm a special educator and working with a student, modifying the work, making sure the student does the work, and I'm not in the math classroom all the time. Am I able to work with the math curriculum coordinator to develop assignments based on the standards that the student could do. Do I understand all aspects? Same thing for science, English language arts. Make sure there's some collaboration. I don't feel that if you educator work by themselves, they would be truly successful in designing all the work for the student. I mean, as they say, and not to be cliche, people say it takes a village. If you're working on a portfolio with a student with a complex challenge, it's really going to be a group task. It really shouldn't just be a special educator working with a student by themselves. Everyone should be taking part, designing work. Again, the student could be included in science. You just give the science teacher what are some of the requirements, they're teaching it, and they develop a quiz, and the student takes that quiz during the classroom like everybody else. So they're included. It doesn't have to be something separate. It could be part of their general curriculum. We're collecting this information, making sure we're instructing the students on the standards, and making sure we're aware of due dates. Let's make sure we're aware of the due dates when this portfolio is due. Go to our website, look at the manual, all that information is included there. As I said, this will take about a half an hour. This presentation's not that dense. I want to give everyone just an overview of what it is, how to get, if you have a student that fits this profile, how to get information about it, how to start collecting it. I don't expect anyone to go to this presentation or just review the manual and go off on their own and complete a successful portfolio. I do expect that if you have a student that you're communicating with me, with the department, with your team, back and forth. If you have questions, I'm certainly willing to help you on the way. And there are other trainings that we have throughout the year for what we call portfolios in progress, or we have review sessions for portfolios in January and in March, where if you're collecting this type of portfolio, you can come, you can get support. And thank you for paying attention, and thank you for your time. Again, my name is Robert Pellicciati. Feel free to email me, and I hope everyone has a successful start of the school year. I know we're in October, so most people are up and running. And everyone have a great, wonderful week. Enjoy the rest of your day.